Hi guys, Ashley here. Today I'm bringing you another phenomenal guest, Gabor Holch, intercultural leadership coach and consultant. Gabor came to China in 2002 and has worked in a lot of leadership roles in the country. Today, he's helping both international companies in China to get their leadership right and their intercultural communication right in the country, and helping Chinese executives abroad. Gabor, welcome on the show.
Thank you for having me, Ashley.
We have such an important topic to discuss today when it comes to bridging the two cultures. At a time like this, with a lot of tensions, be it geopolitical, technological, societal, cultural, economical, there are more bridges to be built, but somehow it's becoming more and more difficult to build those bridges. And one of the reasons is the COVID pandemic, where people could not travel, people could not really visit their regional or China offices, where a lot of, let's say, expats left the country. And right now, after the pandemic, it's only been, well, less than a year, we are kind of restarting to reimagine this joint vision for 2024 together. So let's start from the very, very beginning, the golden age of foreign businesses in China. We are not in it right now, but there was this golden age of foreign businesses in China. What was it? When was it? And is it truly over?
Well, first of all, the short answer to the second question is yes, it is truly over. Basically, there are many indicators, anything from macroeconomic indicators to actually how many people enter the country each year. And then even if we look at people entering the country each year, we can look at the number of students, which it's a very, very important indicator because this is one of the most important sources of new foreign workforce in China. But if we look at the number of, let's say, business visas issued, business visits to China, if we look at the performance of international companies in China, if we look at the number, which I recently saw, of foreign employees in international companies in China, which has really dropped drastically, we can see that it has definitely ended. Why it ended and how it ended, basically, this is what a lot of researchers want to look at. And this is also something that I help understand when I work with executives as coaches or as a coach, or I support companies as such. Now, when exactly it was, obviously it happens on a number of factors. It even can vary in different industries. But generally speaking, the people say the golden age of international companies in China started with China's accession to the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in 2001, and started ending. So the beginning of the end was around 2013-14. And by the time the pandemic hit, actually it was truly over without even the pandemic. So with or without the pandemic, this downward trajectory would have continued, but of course it continued much more sharply because of the pandemic.
This is kind of worrying to hear. And I'm looking forward towards the end of this talk when you're going to talk about the future projections. But let's focus on the things at hand right now. So when it comes to these international / Chinese organizations trying to make business together, be it in China or abroad, what do you see as the biggest obstacles, be it the cultural clashes, business, work culture? What shall we all know?
Well, I'm not a macro expert, so to speak. I am not an economist, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about larger economic factors. I think you actually talk to people who bring that perspective. I deal with companies, and it's important to understand that I, as an advisor and as a coach, I deal with the individual manager. So that is my preferred perspective. I can also go up 1 or 2 levels higher because I work with senior executives, so we can also look at the strategic perspective. One thing that you have to know about a market-based international company in China is that it's extremely resilient. So there are lots of things that we tend to blame in our heads for, let's say, an international company struggling in China. And one of them is cultural differences. The other one is, let's say, unfriendly legislation. When it comes to, there are too many controls on investment, there are too many controls on sending people to a given country. But companies can deal with that. Actually, they can deal with an awful lot. When it comes to culture, this is exactly why global firms and China cooperated on building this kind of what we very often call a bubble or a microeconomy of a handful of Chinese cities, really. So we are talking about up to half a dozen cities where the overwhelming majority of foreigners live and work. And we talk about something when we say, let's say the three biggest cities, China, Shanghai, Guangzhou conurbation, including Shenzhen, that's where, let's say, 2/3 of foreigners have ever lived and worked. If we go up to the half a dozen biggest cities, then it's over 90% of the foreigners. So on one hand, China provided this culturally not so shocking landing ground for international business. And when it comes to the companies themselves, they build an environment within China which is much easier to figure out for foreigners, whether they are in the country for 2 weeks or 5 years, than, let's say, the mainstream Chinese culture would be, let's say, in a small city or in a genuinely Chinese company. What really puts international business to the test right now is two things. One is unpredictability. So tough laws companies can deal with. Unpredictable laws, they find it much more difficult to comply with them, and also, to attract investors, to attract talent, and so on. Because if you never know what is going to happen day after tomorrow, let's say, even a high-level hiring process takes 6 months. So you cannot tell a candidate, well, don't know exactly how it's going to happen, but this is our offer. If you are a planner, like the executives that I work with, it usually means that you're implementing plans that were made at least a year ago, based on a completely different reality. So this is number one. The other problem that international business has been suffering with for a while is basically that the role of international investors, international business, in the overarching rhetoric of the Chinese political leadership has changed absolutely dramatically. So when I arrived in China, then Jiang Zemin was in charge in China and was just handing over to Hu Jintao. But basically, at that time, the message to Chinese people was that the goal is to build a better China, but learn from foreigners. Get information you cannot get at home. Try to build partnerships, try to build bridges. Today, the message is completely different. If you read Chinese language media or you listen to Chinese language media, it almost sounds like international business is a necessary evil which is on the way out. And it very often sounds like foreign people and foreign businesses represent unwelcome values. And that is very difficult to deal with because it cuts into the real human relationships that make business work.
And does it anything to do with the actual culture, or is it everything to do with the narrative? Because I love it how you put it. You said that, companies can deal with a lot of stuff. You give them new regulations, you give them new frameworks, you give them challenges, you give them stimulus or restrictions, they can work with that. The other thing they can, only navigate around is the big narrative. And in the country like China, a big narrative is the most important thing, right? It is the story that transcends departments, government departments, transcends companies, transcends everything. So the narrative has changed when it comes to international businesses and by association foreigners that are based in the country, right? Previously, a big example is, let's say, teachers, right? English teachers. If you were Lao Wai, right, a foreigner, very often, even if you did not come from English as a native language country, you would, teach English or work part-time, most of the times illegally. Right now, it's considered really, really, first of all, dangerous because You are going to be reported also by students, parents, etc., etc. And they are considered as unwelcome, unqualified migrants. So do they still want foreign teachers? Yes, but they want highly qualified teachers, which in one way is a natural progression, right? They just want to have higher qualified migrants, higher qualified professionals. On the other hand, again, the narrative changed, but at the same time, is there some truth to it? Do Westerners actually represent some of the unwelcome values because the cultures are so different and they are clashing? What is it?
Yes. So there are two sides to the story. One of them is what do we mean by culture? And this is where I usually start my work, because you couldn't imagine, I mean, you have extensive China experience, you speak the language, you have been all over the place. So you know what a versatile, what a diverse place China is. And I am not going to shock you, because you know as much as I do, how many managers, how many diplomats, how many students try to prepare themselves for the cultural reality of China, just basically looking at a culture map, seeing, okay, China is one of those Confucian societies, reading up a little bit on Confucius, maybe reading up a little bit about, how Chinese people use Confucian values and Sun Tzu's The Art of War in negotiation or in leadership and so on. And then they assume, all right, now I'm ready and I can start doing business in China. But then there is an enormous shock when they find out that that kind of culture exists. Maybe statistically that's the mainstream culture, but it exists, let's say, beyond the daily reality of most foreigners. As I mentioned, most foreigners live in these large megapolises like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen. And then even if you spend a couple of months in the country, you know that people who live in those places, especially people who grew up in those places, they are not the harmonious, obedient, let's not ruffle feathers kind of people. They are people, if they were, let's say, born in Shanghai, then they grew up competing for everything from the middle school examination to university positions, to jobs, to promotions. They are really tough. They are really task and achievement focused. If they are immigrants in cities like this, then they had to stand up to the local population, and they had to prove that they are worth their salt. So if you look at research, not on the culture, but on the subcultures of China, and this explains a lot of quite mysterious aspects of China connecting to the world, you can see that the mainstream culture of large internationalized Chinese cities is much closer to that of the United States than to the mainstream Chinese culture. If you look at the internal culture of government bureaus, the internal culture of the Communist Party, again, is basically much closer to Western values than it is to mainstream Chinese cultures. Student is an interesting thing, because academia, universities, is one of those niches, one of the subcultures, where traditional Chinese values that you want to call Confucian if you want, is preserved the most in a modern urban environment. So very often the shock to students come when they graduate from a Chinese university and then they have to enter the workforce. By the way, this is the same shock that Chinese students experience. Because one of the things we know about Chinese education is it doesn't perfectly prepare you for competition in the workplace. Now, about values, because we are moving on from culture, which is, it can look hazy, but it's still measurable, and there is a quite objective, comparative debate going on that coaches like myself can use in our work. When it comes to somebody who represents the right values or not, then the question is always who says what's the right value and what is not? Is it codified? Is it created bottom up or top down? And in this case, in China, when it comes to the narrative of foreigners, we all know how this works. For the benefit of those who don't, because they haven't lived in China for a long time, the right values are whatever the party and the government say the right values are, because they are the ones that get built into laws. They are the ones that get built into law enforcement. They are the ones that get built into the judiciary process, into education, into journalistic expressions. For example, if you are a foreigner and even if you speak fluent Chinese, if you want to publish in Mandarin, if you want to appear as a public speaker, as an influencer, and so on. So there is not an awful lot of debate about what those right values are after all. So exactly this is the reason why now I'm going a little bit to the philosophical direction, but the ethical context of what you do, it can change overnight. It can change absolutely overnight. And let's say, that's why I encourage executives to learn about the political context, even if a lot of executives that I coach tell me how they hate politics. But China has always been a place that is very difficult to understand and do business in if you don't get the general political context. And then in the last 5 years, this has changed dramatically, and now you really, really have to. I always told people, read up a little bit on the 5-year plans, read up a little bit what the party does, including in corporations. But now you have to go quite deep to understand what's going to happen to your business next. If they suddenly change the one-child policy, it's going to influence your human resources. If they suddenly change what is allowed and what is not allowed in the public sphere, like the so-called qibu, the 7 no's, then some of the values that are on your wall in the company as one of the core values of the firm can actually directly conflict with everything the Chinese people read in the newspaper and hear on television.
That's very interesting perspective, and I loved it how you separated the traditional kind of understanding of what culture is with the actual subculture. First of all, I think also for most of the people following me online, they know that China is not one unified kind of market, right? It's a joke. It's more like Europe. I mean, Guizhou and Guangzhou couldn't be more different. A person from Chongqing or Chengdu, just a few thousand kilometers away, but again, they live completely different lifestyles, have different aspirations. So when it comes to their culture, there's a lot of locality. And actually, globally, we can also see that localization of cultures and localization of everything versus globalization is becoming a trend because we feel more connected. The more connected we become digitally, the more disconnected we actually become emotionally. So that is why we are thriving to build a closer community in our locality. So I don't want to just drink Coke, but I want Coke bottle or something to say Hong Kong, or that it's helping an orphanage, somewhere near me. So we are trying to kind of find our new way of building those communities and being together. So of course China is a collection of all those very complicated thousands of years old cultures that may or may not be completely contrasting, right? For example, women in Chongqing are considered bad-tempered, hot, and very loud, but women in, let's say, Guizhou are considered very kind of pleasant to get along with. And these are all kind of Chinese women. So traditional culture, and I think that's what a lot of people refer to when they think about, reading upon the laws of war and stratagems and whatnot. General direction is that it's about harmony. It's about looking at the whole forest rather than one tree. And it's about, all those big slogans and stratagems. It still exists, in my view. It still exists. It is something that China has exported across Asia for the past many, many years, thousands of years. That general desire to be an esteemed, established, harmonious society is still there. So the common good is interpreted in a different way, and it's generally regarded higher than probably in many other parts of the world. But then it comes to regional cultures, they can be completely different. And then another layer that you've mentioned is individual values. What you've said just now is that the values are ultimately dictated and then can change in the form of, again, slogans, right? We see those slogans. For example, I mean, you've been to any place in China. I just flew back from Shanghai, and there's a lot of construction going on as always. And all these walls of construction sites typically have slogans. Like previously the slogans were about going to the bathroom, please do not pee at the construction site. Right now the slogans are about building a harmonious society and getting digital literacy. They are calling you up to become digitally literate so you could participate in a different level of opportunity. So it's very, very interesting. But do these slogans actually translate in what people value? To some extent, maybe yes, but to other extent, Chinese people are not stupid. They know the slogans are there to kind of curate and give the direction. But I truly, truly, truly believe that they also have their own values that are evolving as a part of a, again, subgroup, as a part of, as you said, living in Shanghai and living, let's say, in some place in Urumqi is a completely different experience, not only as a foreigner, but also as a local person, because the values around you and culture and experiences and job opportunities and many, many, many things are very, very different. So yeah, there's just so many topics to really cover here in that respect. So, in your experience, when it comes to expats that are coming to China and they are faced with that complexity, what kind of expats, with what kind of mindset, skills, actually succeed at work? Typically, they come for a leadership role. Most of the top professionals come for a leadership role. Sometimes they come for niche engineering or teaching jobs, but let's talk about leaders that come to lead the company or a division. And what kind of expats fail?
Well, let me first reflect on what you said before, because there were a couple of very good points about culture. So the way culture works is that we have different temperaments. You can use it, you can call it personality if you want to. And we are all born into a given culture or a subculture. So if you want to look at, let's say, the diversity of the market that you mentioned, you don't necessarily have to go so far. You don't have to go to one part of China or the other. You can just look, I look out of the window here, I can see another apartment on the other side of the street, which, like, each apartment in this block costs 2 million euros. Then I look on the other side, it's obviously people who are financially not well off living. And that's exactly how it works. The labor of the people on the left side is cheaper than the labor on the people of the right side. So people who live in this building go and clean that building. This is how market works. The same commodity, people's time, people's labor, something that they made, a service that they provide, or even a song that they wrote. It just costs a different amount of money and it can be left, right, and it can be up, down in the same society. So this is how it works. Now, the interesting thing is that people are born with a certain set of values, which is coded in your genes, which is your personality. And then those values have ethical consequences. So people who are impatient, then they like impatient people and they like impatient environments. But there is no the same thing about let's say when you meet conflict. Do you try to resolve that conflict by, like, turning up the heat, saying let the best idea win, or by applying empathy and listen, right? Now the interesting thing is that we all have our temperaments, but there is no guarantee we are born in the right culture. So it can happen that somebody who is jumpy and impatient, has a short attention span, very social, is born in a society like Japan. And then I will spend my life seeking like-minded people, right? And it can happen that I find like-minded people in my own society. So for example, I join a professional community where my temperament is welcome, or it can happen that I'm just not happy in my native culture and then I go across the world and start a new life. And that's us, actually. This is how the psychology of expat assignment works. That people somehow feel, they go over to the other side of the world, like you went to Hong Kong, and then you say, for a weird reason, I feel more at home here than actually at home. So this is the way it works with values and cultures. Now, when people try to adopt to a certain culture, then they need some kind of consistency. They need time to figure out how the corporate culture of that firm works, or how the values of those let's say those communities. I don't say country because you never experience the culture of the country. Let's say in my case, as I live in Shanghai, I would even say how Jing'an district works. Not just Shanghai, because even Shanghai is very diverse. The difficult thing in China is that basically, as we said, there is a top-down definition with a very heavy influence on people's daily life. And it makes the definition of even ancient Chinese culture change. So what is ancient Chinese culture? There are certain people who have the right to say what ancient Chinese culture is. Then they change the law. Then they change enforcement. Then they change behavior. So let me give you a couple of examples. Around the time when I arrived in China first in 2002. So it's since 2002 that I continuously lived in China. And then let's say if you came with me to China in 2002, 3, 4, you have to imagine China is gearing up for the Olympic Games. China has just joined the WTO. And then the European Chamber of Commerce, the American Chamber of Commerce already existed. You go to a networking event, or somebody who knows Chinese culture very well comes to one of the corporations and makes a speech about respecting Chinese culture when you do business in China. One of the things they would have told you is that kickbacks are part of traditional Chinese culture. So I'm sorry, if you do business here in China, and if you're in sales or if you're in investment, sorry, that's the way traditional Confucian society works. This is the way that you have to respect it, and you have to adopt to it. Now, fast forward a little bit, and then suddenly it's not part of traditional Chinese culture anymore. The cultural narrative changes, and what you hear on on podcast, or when you see the leader making a speech, or when you read it, in traditional Chinese culture, the leader is supposed to be morally superior, and therefore, in traditional culture, Confucius society, and since the leader is supposed to be morally superior, kickbacks are not allowed and actively punished. So now, kickbacks are not part of traditional Chinese culture. Let me give you another example. Let us look at the role of women, and especially the role of women in corporations and politics. Around the time when I arrived in China, one of the most significant, let's say, trends in business and politics in China was that more and more female participation. So I remember when the richest person in China was for the first time a woman, when women started going higher and higher in the Chinese Communist Party, and if you look at the statistics of the Communist Party, more than half of the people who apply for Communist Party membership are women, but less than a third of who are accepted are women. And then the higher you go, the less women you meet. Now, again, we heard a lot about Mao Zedong saying women hold up half the sky and so on and so forth. You fast forward, and then one-child policy is abandoned, and suddenly larger families are encouraged. And one of the ways that the political leadership encourages larger families is for women to stay at home and bear babies. And correspondingly, immediately, if you look at corporations, Chinese corporations primarily, and you look at the Communist Party, the percentage of women in those organizations start dropping almost immediately. So both of these contrasting narratives are actually, let me put it this way, sold to the public based on traditional Chinese values. So what are traditional Chinese values anyway? About 10 years ago, there was a brilliant study. It was, I think, finally published either by Oxford or Cambridge University Press. If you go to my website and check reading, then it's there. Who started looking for companies that are run according to a traditional Confucian model of a family enterprise. And then they found out most of those firms are in Southeast Asia. They are run by Chinese families, multi-generation Chinese families, but they are not in mainland China itself. So to your question, which kind of expat, which kind of foreigner thrives and which one just survives in China. And when I did the research for my book, Dragon Suit, which is specifically about high-level executives, foreign executives in China, but I also talked to an awful lot of other people like entrepreneurs, investors, coaches, and so on. Basically, what we found is a kind of curve, a recurring curve. Around the time when I arrived in China, or if psychologically I even go back a little bit before, because in the late 90s, my father worked in China. So one of the reasons I arrived in China, because I heard so many stories of doing business there. So then the foreigner that companies sent to China had to be a pioneer. And that didn't really have to be a technical expert, didn't really have to be very deeply embedded in the organization, which is usually good, because if a foreigner, if somebody is deeply embedded in the organization, they are usually a little bit worried to take an expat assignment, because then they lose their guangxi at home, so to speak. So these were people who knew the firm, knew the product just well enough, but they were great at foreign languages. They were great social networkers. At that time, it didn't mean internet. It just meant literally socially networking.
Yeah.
They were flexible. They were good with challenging authority when it was necessary, but brown-nosing authority when it was best for the business. So you can read about like the first CEO of Boeing in China, who went out and like drank baijiu and smoked together with the government officials and so on. And then as time goes on, and then we enter the era of scientific development of Hu Jintao and so on, and the number of international workforce in China grew, then what China needed was a steady mid-management level foreigner, typically, who comes to China, who is a technical expert, because there was more diversification at those firms now, who brings their family, who are steadily in China, definitely not going to spend their evenings drinking with state-owned enterprise officials. Take a good rest, go to work in the morning, write the code, do the quality control, do the finance, do the HR. And then interestingly, but I think it's quite intuitive for people who are in China right now, we are kind of getting back to the pioneer era. Because now, you see, the number of foreign employees in China is dropping drastically. There are a lot of them, like a quarter of international companies in China now function without a single foreign employee. Yeah. So you don't need the cohorts of technical experts and mid-managers. So if you look at expertise, education, and so on, actually it's easy to find in China somebody who has the relevant foreign education. So why do you need foreigners? You need them as connectors. You need them as strategy implementers. You need them as networkers. You need them as influencers. And that profile is very similar to the kind of WTO accession era, a little bit. So let's look at the daily life of foreigners. Most expats like living near other expats. They like friends who understand them. Let's face it, I know that a lot of China experts say just learn Chinese, but that's not going to happen. Most experts are in China for 5 years or less. They are not going to become fluent in Mandarin. So they need friends, they need colleagues, they need doctors, they need restaurateurs, teachers who speak their language. And right now, China is a very difficult place in this respect, because you are probably going to land in an almost fully Chinese environment. And you are going to live your life in either the broken Mandarin or the broken English, or on either side.
Or broken, just simply broken.
Something like that, yes. Unless you arrive some young people, they arrive in China, or some former China experts arrive in China in fluent Mandarin. So again, I would say, when I advise or coach human resource executives or CEOs or people who are responsible for selecting people, I would say, choose somebody with a very flexible mentality. Choose somebody who is social, because otherwise you can get very lonely, and that undermines your performance. Choose somebody who speaks several languages, because then they are more likely to pick up Mandarin. Preferably don't choose people with families, because this is a measurable fact that China is becoming more and more difficult for people with families. So either choose somebody young who hasn't established a family yet, or somebody whose kids went off to college and now they can do whatever they do. Easier for men than women, for obvious reasons, for the kind of zeitgeist that we mentioned after the one-child policy ended. I don't know, maybe I'm leaving something out, but your question will help me there.
Absolutely. No, this is very, very good. I wanted to ask you another question, but right now you got me at the women and men, this gender imbalance. China has, for, as you said, probably the past 30, 40 years been empowering women in general. And there have been high points, there have been low points, right? And of course, in China, when it comes to women, we are also kind of existing in two parallel worlds a little bit, with one being, once you become the dragon woman, right? So once you become an entrepreneur, once you become a top corporate executive, you are in a completely different kind of bracket, right, for majority of society. For example, the head of Chongqing Mafia for years was a woman, right? She was the most feared mafia boss of the country.
The most famous pirate in Chinese history was a woman.
Well, think about history, like ancient history, and now we're talking about even modern history. But at the same time, there was this other kind of completely parallel world where, you know, women were also expected to, you know, have babies by 26, and they were called left over if they're not married, etc. And all that was very depressing, especially if you were, you know, less educated, you had less opportunities, you came from, you know, from basic occupations. But that also created a completely different, I would say, energy among the highly educated women from Shanghai, Guangdong, you know, Beijing, all the cities that you mentioned, where they say, you know what, I do not want to get married. I do not want to live your expectations. And even if I don't become extremely successful in this man's corporate world, I'm going to live life on my own terms. That is a very kind of new and very, very strong, very women empowered kind of thought process that is rather prevalent today with many Gen Zs. So when it comes to women today, I think that's what we're finding out. The government says, yes, 3 babies. Actually, they should have just said, just have as many babies as you want. But okay, 3 babies. Nobody really wants to have kids. Nobody really wants to give up their work or occupation. In general, young generation is a little bit disillusioned with this whole rat race, and previously, in my impression, when it comes to young people, you speak with a young taxi driver somewhere in Shenzhen or in Beijing, and he tells you this beautiful story saying that doesn't matter how hard I work, as long as I make a lot of money, you know, it's all great. Right now the story is very different. They don't want to work that hard. A lot of people, just a friend of mine was telling me that he's recently hired in Shanghai a person who's been working in Baidu for 4 to 5 years as an SEO specialist. So in one of the China's largest tech companies, 5 years full-time experience. And she came to him and he hired her below 10,000 RMB. Below 10,000 RMB. Why did she agree to such a low wage? She said, I don't want a lot of money. I want stability. So, of course, the mindset is changing for young people. But also when it comes to women, right? You've just now said that there is this drop when it comes to party leadership, when it comes to corporate leadership in women numbers. Do you believe this drop is somehow orchestrated from above? Is it implemented by the companies, by the man in the boardroom? Or is it because you feel that women really feel that, oh, finally, we have an opportunity to stay at home and have children? Where is it coming from, and what can we expect in that area?
Right. So the peculiarity of a society like China is that human decision makers, with their backgrounds and biases and preferences, they decide on gigantic social trends that are usually guided by public opinion in most societies. And not just because it's a democracy, let's say, but because simply even if a society is completely chaotic, which city people choose and which profession they choose and how do they choose to marry and how many kids they want to have, and whether they want, as the famous Chinese TV show guest said, laugh on a bicycle or cry in a BMW. That's up to them to decide. Now in China is different because the way it happens is that the leadership decides on certain macro social and macroeconomic things, and then basically the society has to follow through because it's such a closely controlled society. Could be in the good sense of the word. So obviously one of the things that foreigners love about China is that it's safe. You can, in any Chinese city, you can walk home in the middle of the night, but it also means it's a very closely guarded society, and that is true from a very early age. So very often people, when they are born into a certain kind of reality, they just cannot imagine the alternative, right? So my wife is from Shanghai. She is part of the beginning of the one-child policy situation. So it means that our generation is still mixed from Chinese families that had multiple kids and Chinese families that didn't. Because if you were in the People's Liberation Army, or if you were in certain ethnic minorities, and so on and so forth, then you were allowed a second and a third kid. Now, if you look at specifically women, there are a couple of things. Again, I would like to put this together from a couple of puzzle pieces. The first thing is that even in societies where we are the closest that we know to a kind of gender equity in business, and this is very sad that we're still talking about this. One could say that we had 1 million years to solve this problem. And then if you listen to executives, if you listen to stand-up comedy, this is one of those big questions in the world that we still couldn't solve. But even in the north of Europe, even in places like Germany, where we are quite close to women having equal opportunities in large companies, the women who join large companies are not those women who necessarily represent the values that we want women to bring to large companies. So this can be a little bit confusing, but if you check online the book The Leading Brain, whose author is a kind of a mentor of mine, you can read studies that women who join large corporations and get promoted there, they are women who are on average tougher, less patient, less of a good listener than the female population in general. So already there is a little bit of a bias there. And this is when we look at let's say those Western or those Asian societies where women and men, they have an almost equal opportunity. If you look at China over time, the bigger half of university students are women, but the more powerful position you look at in politics, in business, in academia, the less women you find. And the heyday, the golden age of foreign business in China was also the golden age of education, university education specifically in China, where a lot of new universities were created, a lot of international programs were started. Chinese professors started doing research, not just teaching, which improved the quality of education. And women started going out and wanted to have a nice career for themselves. And one place where they could do that, apart from newly founded companies, was foreign companies. Because the bias in foreign companies, just purely based on gender, was much lower than the large employers in China, which was mainly state-owned companies, and the kind of companies like Huawei, which are private companies, but the corporate culture is not, how do you say, is not more welcoming to a different kind of work style.
More hostile.
I wouldn't say it's more hostile, but you know, a culture is always a culture. You either love it or leave it. And for example, Huawei was founded by people from the People's Liberation Army, so they have a very tough culture in those places. Now, of course, in multinational companies, gender equity was an outspoken and very closely followed goal. So Chinese women who were highly educated, they were smart and ambitious, they liked joining these companies because they saw themselves in those values. Anyway, international companies in a society like China, this is why people who work there from abroad will not experience, in air quotes, real Chinese culture. Because these companies attract Chinese people who don't want to live in traditional Chinese culture. They want to work. I interview thousands of them. They want to meet foreigners. They want to try foreign food. They want to travel abroad. They want something. You cannot imagine how many young Chinese people, when I asked them, why do you want to work in a foreign company? They said, I want to live my days like I see it on TV, in Western TV shows. You know, the way they talk to their boss, the way they interrupt each other, and the way they like drink coffee everywhere. Anyway, so if you look at this kind of environment, it was quite welcoming to women. But because international companies are little islands of cosmopolitanism in the middle of a city which is also more cosmopolitan than China in general, that's also a place where values clash with each other. And if you are a manager in one of these companies, you have to be very careful how you manage your corporate culture in an environment that doesn't necessarily align with your corporate culture. Let me give you an example. In Dragon Suit, if you read the book, you can find one of the chief human resources officers of Danone, the food company, saying we had to make very careful decisions. Sometimes we were on thin ice because, for example, according to the one-child policy, the legal regulation of one-child policy, if we became aware that one of our employees had a second child, we had to report that to the authorities. And the authorities decided if this was a violation of the one-child policy or not. But human resources managers in their company decided not to report that because it clashed with their corporate values. So you have to make sure that obviously if corporate values and local values clash so quickly, especially in a country like China, where the nation's values can change so quickly, you have to make a decision which values do you adhere to and immediately call the corporate lawyer and figure out how you can do it without violating the law of the People's Republic of China. Fast forward to today and then two-child policy, three-child policy, and your question about is it a cause and effect or is it just a coincidence? Actually, no, it's cause and effect, because another thing that makes people take sides between values is utility. When is my life going to be easier? So let's take another example. In China right now, there is a huge backlash against looking flamboyant, right? So don't dye your hair, don't wear colored contact lenses, don't wear tattoos. And actually, I think it was you a couple of days ago who posted on LinkedIn that on the subways, people painted for Halloween were banned. So you can feel the sign of the times. Now, if I'm a young person and I know that youth unemployment is somewhere between 20 and 30% in China right now, and I need a job and I need money, and I had like purple dreadlocks before, then of course I will give it a second thought. Is it time to have a more conventional hairdo, because it increases my chances of getting a job? So people don't just listen to their hearts, they also listen to their wallets. And then when drastic changes happen, like for example, from one-child policy to the two-child policy and the three-child policy, and then have as many children as you want, then obviously women are going to look at what does society want me to do? And if your temperament is a more conforming or conformist kind of temperament, then it will change the way you look for a job, you look for a husband, you plan your future, you save money. All of these things, and it adds up, especially in a large society like China. And people who do business there, they must know these things, because these are your employees, these are your customers, these are the people who might invest in your company, or who just might, support or not support a newspaper article about singling your company out.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it all. Still on the question that I asked initially, moving away from the women and going back to the what does it take to actually, succeed in China? That's what we were talking about initially. Work and business-wise, what can we learn from China? Because right now we have pointed out a couple of things that are quite distressing, right? What we are saying is basically there was this beautiful time. It was about 10 years ago when foreigners were welcome, when Everybody felt that tomorrow is going to be better than today, when there was this alignment on the policy and the fact that we need to learn from each other and become better together. And there was this energy just infused in everything we did. And right now we are at a place where, not just due to the pandemic, right, but you basically shattered our dreams and hopes, and said that it's not related to just the pandemic, but the decline has actually started much earlier, 2013-14. And we are right now entering this, completely different, much more paced out collaboration stage, much colder, much cooler, both for domestic employees and for domestic companies and businesses, and of course for international as well. On top of all that, we have a broader, very negative story in the media and geopolitical situation, etc. So when it comes to succeeding, right, we can of course succeed in China, but we can also learn probably some things from the China market. There are successful companies in China that are able to reinvent themselves, move with a lot of speed. Yes, you've mentioned Huawei, there's Haier, there's Xiaomi, right, that all have very unique models, and these models might or might not be applicable in a broader kind of Southeast Asia or broader world, but there's definitely lessons to learn from both their successes and failures. So when it comes to work/business, what do you think the world, so to say, can learn from China's experience so far?
Well, the world learns from China, and I wouldn't even qualify it. I wouldn't even say can learn, but the world learns from China in two ways. One of them is China is human history's largest human testing ground. Exactly for the reasons that we mentioned just now, is that basically no other country has a leadership, such power over such number of people to say, well, let's see if we don't have one child family, but we have 2 or 3, then what will happen? What happened if we don't allow people to migrate from this city and that city? Now what happens if we do allow them? Now what happens if we just actually move them? Like the story of Chongqing, where, at a certain time, when they finished the Three Gorges Dam, they basically doubled the population of an already large city. So
my hometown, my Chinese hometown.
So you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's right. Already it was a country-sized city, but then suddenly it was the size of 2 of the same country. So this is also the reason why China is the #1 testing market for so many industries, like pharmaceuticals, for example. Clinical tests, clinical trials. China is a superpower because many of these trials are impossible to do in other countries. So this is one way, because companies need space, they need volume to test data, to test chemicals, to safety, whatever it is. I am working with companies whose job it is to do quality control for other companies, and then in China, the volume of testing is just unbelievable. Let me give you another example. Quite a few years ago, I needed a minor surgery, and one of my friends was a Japanese medical doctor living in China. So I thought, first of all, he knows about China, but secondly, he's impartial, and I asked him, listen, if you were me, would you have this surgery in my home country, Hungary, which is known for good doctors, actually, or you would have it in China? And he looked at me and says, are you crazy? Do you know what the success of surgeries depend on? It depends on how many previous surgeries a doctor has done. And then when a Hungarian doctor has, let's say, in a given year does 20 of these surgeries, a Chinese doctor does 20 a month. So this is one thing, one way of companies to learn from China. This is also, by the way, why all the companies want to bring their digital products to China, or why Volkswagen wants now to develop, and same with BMW and a couple of other companies, their digitally smart cars, the development itself to China. This is also the reason why China makes it so difficult, because they want to create a kind of isolated environment. But this is another story. The other way that the world learns from China, and actually a little bit too late, but politicians and executives are finding this out to their horror, is that in certain way China is and has been for a long time ahead of the rest of the world. So I cycled back to about 10 years ago, and then I think you were already in consulting at that time. Do you remember when lean and agile were like the cool new things?
Ah, yes.
Okay.
Back in the day.
So at that time, that was a training methodology, because one thing I do is I help international consulting and training companies to bring their methods to China and localize them to the local market. So many of these products actually don't make it finally to the Chinese market. But one of these products was this kind of lean and agile way of working with large teams in large companies, including Chinese ones. So they brought it we worked together, we did the research, and basically we just found out China doesn't need this product. Because any kind of
because they are lean and agile.
Exactly. Any kind of fast-moving, flexible, very result-orientated behavior that this training methodology would train people to follow, including teamwork and how to work with each other. Chinese people are doing it right now. So even then, China was a little bit ahead, just there was not so much attention on this factor. But then this kind of attitude, because we know how agile and fast Chinese people can be. Why? Because they grew up in a hysterically changeable environment, in a pathologically changeable environment. So when suddenly the Chinese government changes, I don't know, certain restrictions on data, or changes the tax law, or they change certain the price of some raw material, then suddenly the foreign employees, they just gather in the meeting room, what are we going to do? And then you have worked in that kind of environment. You know, Chinese people look up from their work, then they look back, they keep working, because they are used to these kind of changes. Now, what happened since that time is that, okay, at that time it was the soft skill part, right? It was behavior. A lot of foreigners, when they came to China, that's exactly where they wanted to learn. Not Confucian harmony, not Guangxi, not the kind of hierarchy that China represented, but they wanted to learn speed and flexibility, because this is what they could really learn in the Chinese environment. In the meantime, this speed and flexibility exited the intangible soft skills world and got built into the products and brands that China builds. And that's why right now, European and American companies, and Japanese companies, I might add, are so scared of Chinese electric vehicles. That's why Elon Musk is outspokenly trying to copy a Chinese app when he's trying to build a super app. Because now it's not just society, it's not just culture. Now it's a business model. And business models are possible to objectively compare with each other, and very often I'm sitting in Europe right now, don't compare very well in this respect.
100%. And what on the other side can the world learn, China learn from the world, right? If these are the things that the world can learn from China, what's the other side?
China has been very intensively learning from the world for a very long time. So, actually China starting in the 1980s as a completely broken country with no good legal system. I was already in the country when China created a law to protect private property, to create a HR law, to create a decent tax law. China at that time, when my father was working there, it had horrible infrastructure. North Korea was doing much better at that time. And obviously, I don't have to mention GDP and so on. And when I came to China, I remember that China's economy was the same size as France's. The fact that China created the story that they created, I never tire of reminding people that this was a cooperation. It was not a Chinese miracle. It was a miracle empowered by overseas Chinese people who invested all their money in the motherland of allied countries, because it's easy to forget that Japanese-Chinese relations, American-Chinese relations were at their heyday those times, in those times. So basically, China learned entire industries from Japan, sending their best people, including people from the Communist Party, to Japan to learn from the United States. So they have been learning for a very long time, especially if you ask diplomats, because I was a diplomat before I came to China. If you ask diplomats, China learned a little bit too much from these countries, because now, look at the thing that we said about working agile. China didn't make up those rules. China didn't make up those specifications. The West did. And then China is beating the rest of the world at their own game.
Massively applied, massive action.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So if you ask me what China can learn from the West or from other countries now, I would say I always like comparing countries to people. And then since China is an ancient culture, but is a new country, right? Most of the companies, most of the institutions that you are working with in China now, as a business person or as an investor or a startup entrepreneur, are younger than I am. So China has exited its economic and political infancy, and now it's more like a teenager. So it went a little bit too extreme with, now we will show the world that we can do this alone. And that usually didn't play out very well. A lot of the things that you can hear in China right now, are creating a domestic set of technical specifications which are not necessarily compatible with the rest of the world, localizing everything. Other countries tried that. I mean, Brazil tried to create this kind of technical ecosystem which is incompatible with the rest of the world. Japan tried to succeed on their own without foreign workforces as far as they could. Actually, Japan tried both. Now I'm having discussions with both Chinese and international companies about management localization and employee localization, and also legal localization, because it's not just that international companies passed on management positions to Chinese people from expats, but also in recent couple of years, companies were not forced, but very heavily influenced to conduct most of their business from locally registered entities. And now bridges are crumbling because of the lack of upkeep. So these companies now, if you have to send somebody to an international conference to a foreign country on an urgent basis, they have to leave in 3 days. It's very difficult to find somebody who has the visa, who has the language skills, who has the willingness to leave. Because China is a very political environment. When you leave, something will happen behind your back. Now, basically, if it's a multinational company, then the mothership, the headquarter, and the China branch starts drifting away from each other in terms of compliance, in terms of values, in terms of practices, even in terms of marketing, for example. Like what do we want to tell the market? So I think China will have and let me add one more thing, is that if you sit down and talk to Chinese people in a pub, or if you open the Financial Times or Le Monde and you read an article written by a Chinese person about China's relation to the rest of the world, you very often read, they don't understand us. They use us as a stereotype. They don't really know what's going on in China, and therefore we cannot connect well. But actually, a lot of this is up to China. So I think China has a lot to learn about, all right, it's great to be proud, it's great to be self-sufficient, it's great to be the master of your own future. But you cannot do this alone, right? Because that economy that you're trying to build, that destiny that you're trying to master, that goes to the rest of the world. If you want to be a global power, you need people from those global locations where you want to be successful. If you want to compete in an international market with your domestic products, you need some basic idea of how that product connects with people who are not Chinese. And I think this is going to be how quickly this is going to happen, I don't know, but I think this is the next big task in front of China in general, and specifically Chinese companies, Chinese managers as well. I coach many of them in terms of the next stage of development, so to speak.
And that's a perfect link to the next question. So what are your top tips for senior leaders? Let's start with foreigners. So foreign senior leaders coming to China to lead an organization, to lead a branch. What are your top tips?
I don't have top tips. I start by listening because I used to be a diplomat, now I'm a coach. So before you open your mouth and you say anything, don't do this, do that, say this, don't say that. You really have to be able to get a picture of the temperament of the person. This is extremely important. So again, just like we said, don't tell a country to be agile when they are already agile. The same goes to individuals, right? I mean, I'm not going to tell them, take these values more seriously, be a little bit tougher, be a better listener before I know how tough they are right now and how good a listener they are right now. So it always starts, the process always starts with questions. Actually, as far as the client is concerned, it starts with questions. As far as I'm concerned, it starts with research about the company, about the trajectory, about the industry. And then it very much depends. It also depends on the position that this person will hold. So let's say if you are going to be the CEO of a multinational company in China, if you read Dragon Suit, my book, you will see that this is one title that I work with very often. But your role can be completely different based on the industry, based on the stage of development of the company in China. Like sometimes the CEO is sent there to basically make things happen, increase market share, beat a competitor. At other times, a CEO is sent there to basically consolidate what the company already has, build something slow and steady, lead by example when it comes to compliance, when it comes to planning and so on. So this is the way I start. But what I always tell people not to do is to fall for these simplistic stereotypes about whatever, about China, about Shanghai, about tech firms in Shenzhen. Now, I do believe you must know the stereotype. It doesn't mean that you just forget the stereotype, because the way stereotypes works is a little bit like how much you know about your neighbor if you only hear them through the wall. There is something to it, right? Some families are larger than the others. You hear that some of them, like there are two members of the family who play music, but that's not the complete picture. It's just the first impression. It's better than nothing. But then if you want to interact with those people, then you definitely have to learn a little bit more. So yes, do know the Confucian stereotype. It's not a bad thing. Actually, if you work with agriculture, if you work with academia, if you go to the countryside, if you work with older people like senior citizens, then you are going to see more of those values. Definitely know this, in my opinion, almost comical obsession of foreigners with guanxi. The term guanxi, in my book, I quote another book by Kyle Haggerty, who I love this quote. When the Chinese colleague says to the Western colleagues, let's go out, let's meet these business people and do that guanxi that you foreigners always talk about. So, and I tell them, listen, you will hear this all the time. You might even feel the pressure to kind of master Chinese guanxi, right? But you have to be very careful, because guanxi meant something completely different when I arrived in China, as I already mentioned to you. This is number one. And number two, I did a little bit of research for the book, and I found out that most foreigners guanxi with other foreigners. I also found out that it works. So they still get the results that they wanted to get from Chinese guanxi. And then it's one of my guilty pleasures to ask foreigners, so who is the Chinese person that you trust the most? after, let's say, living in China for 3 years. And you would be very surprised how many of them say, my housekeeper. So if that is the, if that's the outreach of your guanxi, you know, it says a lot. So all of these stereotypes, I would say, learn them, know them, but also know that it's a severely incomplete picture. And then when you go on, I encourage people to understand. So first of all, I work with culture mapping methodologies, which make it possible to map cultural behavior so that the diversity of human behavior doesn't look so messy and confusing anymore. And then I work with people I coach and train and advise. And then after that, be very, very mindful of your microenvironment. So let's say if you do your daily work in a company, does that company, the culture in that office, does it more represent the corporate culture of the company or the mainstream culture of China or the mainstream culture of the city perhaps, or the industry, because it's a fashion company or because it's an engineering company? And I work with people to learn the skills to do a lot of observations without asking too many questions, right? Because people don't want to feel stupid. They don't want to give away too much of their cluelessness, but also because you don't want to interrupt work too often with asking, well, listen, in China, if somebody doesn't respond to my email, but keep sending me WeChat messages, what does it mean? So we work together to read body language, to read verbal clues, basically how people choose their words, to observe interaction between people, and learn about the microculture or the wider environment as much as you can, as fast as you can.
That's a beautiful advice. We are going to finish up with the last question. And the last question is, you've mentioned so many books. First of all, you yourself have a book. It's called Dragon Suits. Guys, check it out. I do have a copy and it's absolutely wonderful. As today, Gabor has delighted us with tons of examples. In that book, you're going to see even more examples. And that's exactly how you learn, by reading the real life stories. What would be some of the other resources, blogs, books that you would recommend people to read, either before they come to work in China or when they are about to lead the Chinese team, or maybe for also Chinese professionals that are going abroad, to build those cultural professional bridges?
Well, I wouldn't be an author who put 3 years of their life into this book if I didn't recommend to actually read the book. And what I wanted to, so Dragon Suit, what I wanted to do is write a book about business that is useful for people who want to do business in China, but I didn't want to write an academic or a too overly businessy manual. So it is based on interviews with foreign executives in China. By the way, sometimes when the book gets introduced, they say Western executives in China, but that is not true, because you will find Asian, Brazilian, and other executives in there. Australian as well. But it's about stories. I interviewed them. I interviewed their executive search professionals. I interviewed their coaches. I interviewed their doctors, because there are a lot of mental health issues involved in working abroad, from being physically fit to the pressures of culture shock. So that is definitely something, if you like what you see, and if you're still with us, then you probably do, then you can find in the show notes how to find the book. If you have my full name, it's very easy to find me online, because there are many Gabors. It's a very typical name in Hungary, and there are many Holches in Northern Europe, but there is only one Gabor Holch. So you will end up with one of my websites. One of them is a blog, the other one's a website of my company. You will end up with my LinkedIn, which is my favorite social media, or perhaps you will stumble onto my YouTube channel, and depending on you like watching more, or you like reading more, I think these will always take you to a forum where I share. I am a storyteller, so not analysis, but how do other people do it? How should you do it? And in any of these resources, you can contact me. And I actually do like it when people reach out to me and drop me a line.
Fantastic.
Did you want me to recommend other books as well?
If there's any other place, absolutely. So definitely Dragon Suit, as we mentioned. And guys, you can Google the full name, right, to find LinkedIn and other channels. But if there's any other resources, because you threw a couple of book names today, so if there's any other resources, do let us know.
Well, first of all, you will eventually you can access it by different URLs, but you might end up with my blog page, and then once you're there, and if you click the tab Reading, then in addition to my own books, you can also find my favorite books. So a couple of books I mentioned, The Leading Brain, for example, by Hans-Werner Hagemann and Frederica Fabricius, you will find it there. Management and Leadership in China, or Leadership and Management in China, I can't remember which one, is the publication that I mentioned, which looks at traditional Confucian values in leadership. I love that book. It's a collection of essays. So you can always find those books through this tab. I always keep something like half a dozen of my favorite intercultural leadership books there, some of them specific to China. There are very good new books as well. I'm a little bit behind on uploading them on my website, but I don't know if you know it, but I have just finished reading the new China playbook by the brilliant author whose name I shamefully forgot momentarily. But I followed her for a while, both when she was in the US and she was in China.
The Economist, right? The Economist.
Yeah, she's an economist, and she is.
Yeah, she's fantastic. I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, she also
very
shares
good.
about her
We're
private
gonna
life.
drop some of those in the show notes.
Yeah, please
I think
do.
another really cool one is called Dragon Tactics. So it's a little bit like, Dragon Suits, Dragon Tactics by Sandrine and Aldo. Also a fantastic book. Also talks about, work cultures. So guys, do check out the books. We're going to drop them all below. Thank you very, very much, Gabor, for being with us. It was a very insightful chat. I think after today's hour, we know a lot more about the cultural difficulties and also broader context of what's happening with expats and the companies in China. And the last word from you is, does the future look bright?
It
What's
looks bright,
next?
yeah. It looks bright in certain industries. So if you're in automotive, if you are in legal services, for example, lawyers make an awful lot of money in China these days. If you are in some kind of upwardly mobile industries like tech, environmental, like green energy, for example, there are lots and lots of opportunities. And also if you are young, you are adventurous, you speak some Chinese or you're willing to learn, then again, China is the place to be.
And on this positive and beautiful note, Gabor, thank you very, very much. Guys, do stay tuned for more Ashley's Digital China to come. I'm going to bring you more outstanding guests going forward. Gabor, thank you, and we're going to chat soon. Bye, guys.
Thank you for the stimulating hosting, Ashley. Thank you very much for having me on the show. Bye-bye.